The emergency room at St. Joseph's was nearly silent at 2 in the morning, except for the soft beep of the monitor beside Isla's bed. Audrey sat in a hard plastic chair, her daughter's tiny hand wrapped in both of hers, watching the rise and fall of that small chest, and telling herself it was going to be fine, it was going to be fine, it was fine. Isla had collapsed at daycare that afternoon. The call came through at 3:30, high fever, severe abdominal pain, wouldn't stop crying. By the time the ambulance reached the hospital, the attending physician had already said the word appendix. Emergency surgery was scheduled within the hour. Audrey had been calling Craig since 4 o'clock. 47 missed calls, spread across 6 hours. She had watched the number climb on her screen while sitting in the surgical waiting room with a cup of cold tea in her hands and absolutely nobody beside her. Craig was in Las Vegas for his company's annual awards dinner. He had told her about it in August, circled the dates on the kitchen calendar himself. The promotion had come through in September. The trip was a celebration, he'd said, a reward for the whole team. He'd promised to keep his phone on. The phone had gone to voicemail every time. She left one message at 4, a second at 5, a third after the surgeon told her Isla was out of surgery and stable, and she'd sat outside the recovery room and cried into a paper towel from the hospital bathroom because there was no one to cry to. She said, "Craig, Isla had emergency surgery tonight. She's okay. But I need you to call me back. Please." He didn't call until the following afternoon. By then, Audrey had been awake for 31 hours. She was sitting beside Isla's hospital bed when the phone finally rang. She picked up. "I just saw your messages." His voice was still slightly rough. "We had a gala dinner last night, and then everyone went out after, and I didn't check my phone until—" "Isla had an appendectomy," Audrey said. She almost kept her voice steady. The silence that followed lasted too long. "Is she okay?" "She's okay. She's sleeping." "God, okay. I'll get the earliest flight I can, okay? I'll be there by tonight." He arrived at the hospital at 7:30 that evening with a stuffed penguin from the airport gift shop. Isla was awake by then, pale and quiet, watching a cartoon on the bedside screen. She smiled when she saw the penguin. She didn't ask where he had been. Audrey stood at the window while Craig sat beside the bed, smoothing Isla's hair, telling her she was the bravest girl he knew. She watched the reflection of it in the glass and thought, "I called you 47 times. Not once did it occur to you to keep your ringer on." She didn't say that, not then. She said it 3 weeks later, in the kitchen, after Isla had been discharged, and the follow-up appointments had been completed, and the house had returned to its ordinary quiet. Craig said he'd explained it already. The gala had a no-phones policy at the dinner. He hadn't realized she'd called so many times. If he had known how serious it was, he would have stepped away. Audrey listened. She had spent 3 weeks listening, waiting to feel something other than the particular cold certainty that had settled in her chest in that waiting room. She didn't feel it. "You knew she'd been running a fever," Audrey said. "I told you that morning." Craig said nothing. Audrey went to the bedroom, pulled a suitcase from the top of the closet, and started packing. She called her sister from the car. Robin picked up on the second ring. "Are you and Isla okay?" she asked before Audrey had said more than hello. "We're okay," Audrey said. A pause held everything the words didn't. Then, "Is there any chance Isla and I could stay with you for a while?" There was no hesitation. "Get on the road," Robin said. "I'll make up the rooms." Robin and Arthur lived in a semi-detached on Burnside Avenue in the West End, close enough to Isla's school that they could walk on good days. Arthur came to the front door before Audrey had even made it up the porch steps, moving carefully, one hand on the railing favoring his left side. He'd herniated a disc in his lower back 8 months earlier lifting a generator at work. He'd had surgery, and the recovery was slow. He took the heavier bag from Audrey's hand without a word and made his way inside ahead of her. The guest bedroom had been made up. A small fold-out cot waited beside the bed, already fitted with sheets covered in blue and white snowflakes, the ones Isla had noticed last Christmas and called the pretty ones. Someone had thought to put a nightlight near the outlet by the door. Audrey sat on the edge of the mattress for a long moment after Isla had drifted off. The house was quiet except for the sound of Robin and Arthur talking softly in the kitchen. It was not an empty quiet. It was the kind of quiet that came when people were nearby. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed that. Craig came to Robin's house twice in the following week. The first time, he stood in the living room, turning his car keys over and over in his hands, and said he hadn't meant for any of this to happen. He said he was sorry. He said he wanted them to come home. Audrey sat on the sofa, with her hands folded in her lap, and listened until he finished. Then she said, "I know you're sorry, and I believe it, but I don't want to come back." His face did something she hadn't expected. Not anger, but a kind of naked confusion, as though he genuinely could not understand how an apology could fail to fix it. She didn't try to explain. Some things could not be explained to someone who had never once sat alone in a hospital waiting room thinking, "Surely he's coming. He'll be here. He must be on his way." The second time he came, he brought his parents. Walter sat in the armchair near the window and said, in a reasonable voice, that every marriage went through hard periods. Doreen stood by the bookshelf and didn't quite meet Audrey's eyes. There was an envelope on the coffee table. She didn't know when it had appeared there. Walter gestured toward it. "For the two of you," he said, "whatever you need." Audrey didn't touch it. She said, "I appreciate that you've come." She said, "I've made my decision." Walter said she was being emotional, that she should think about what was best for Isla. Audrey looked at him steadily and said, "I am thinking about Isla. I've been thinking about her since the moment I realized I was going to be raising her alone." The room fell quiet after that. They left. Doreen paused at the door and looked at Isla, who was sitting on the floor with a coloring book, and her expression was complicated enough that Audrey almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Eli started coming on Tuesday mornings. His name was on the appointment card on the refrigerator, Eli Marchetti, registered physiotherapist, and the first time Audrey actually saw him was a Tuesday, in late November, when she came home from picking Isla up early from school, and found Arthur demonstrating a hip flexor stretch in the living room, while a tall man with dark hair and a therapy bag on the floor beside him watched and made small adjustments to Arthur's posture. Eli looked up when they walked in, smiled at Isla, and said hello to Audrey. That was all. They exchanged about 12 words that first afternoon. But she noticed things in the weeks that followed, the way you notice things about someone who is often quietly present in a space. He adjusted his schedule without complaint when Arthur's follow-up appointment ran long. He wrote Arthur's exercises on a card so he wouldn't have to remember them from conversation. He never made Arthur feel slow or discouraged on the days the progress was harder to see. He fixed the sticky latch on the back door one visit because he mentioned it to Arthur, and Arthur said he kept meaning to get to it, and Eli said he had a screwdriver in his bag. He did it in 3 minutes, wiped his hands on his jeans, and went back to the session. Robin told Audrey later that she'd watched the whole thing from the kitchen and thought, "Who does that?" Isla decided Eli was interesting sometime around the 3rd or 4th visit. She had a habit of sitting close to whatever was happening in the living room without quite joining it. Coloring book on the floor, half her attention on Eli and Arthur working through balance exercises. One afternoon, Eli finished early and sat on the floor beside her while Arthur went to get water. He looked at the picture she was coloring. She had given the cat orange stripes and a blue face. "Practical," Eli said. Isla looked up. "The cat wanted to be blue," she explained. He nodded seriously. "That makes sense." He didn't try to engage her more than that. He didn't perform warmth. He just sat there for a few minutes while she colored, and when Arthur came back he got up and they finished the session, and that was all. But after he left, Isla told Audrey that the physio man had nice eyes. Audrey didn't say anything about that. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday afternoon in January. Audrey took a half day from work. She was the administrative coordinator at a primary school on the east side, a job she'd held for 4 years, and drove to the courthouse in the early afternoon while Isla was at school. Robin offered to come. Audrey said she'd be fine on her own. The courtroom was small and functional. Craig was there with a lawyer. He looked tired in a way she hadn't noticed before. The judge reviewed the agreement, asked each of them in turn, and when Audrey said, "Yes, Your Honor," her voice was clear and steady. She signed first, handed the pen across, didn't watch him sign. Outside, the January air hit her face, sharp and clean, and she stood for a moment on the courthouse steps and let it. Then she got in her car and drove to pick up Isla. The months that followed moved differently than she'd expected. Not easier, exactly, but with a different quality. Less like bracing against something and more like forward motion. Isla settled into kindergarten. Arthur's back improved steadily. Robin started talking about converting the garage, and Audrey let herself think, cautiously, about what the next year might look like. Eli kept coming on Tuesdays. Somewhere between November and April, his visits stopped being Arthur's appointments and started being something harder to categorize. He stayed for dinner one Tuesday when Robin insisted, and Arthur said the chili would go to waste. He brought Isla a children's book about the ocean the week she did a project on whales. He remembered, without being reminded, that Audrey took her coffee black, and one evening when he arrived, and the coffee was already made, he poured her a cup and set it on the counter beside her, without drawing attention to it. There was an afternoon in March when Audrey got home from work and found Eli in the driveway, helping Isla make chalk drawings on the pavement, while Arthur watched from the step. Isla had drawn a house, a sun, 3 birds, and what she described as the ocean but looked more like blue scribbles. She had also drawn 4 stick figures and labeled them in her careful 5-year-old printing. Mommy, Auntie Robin, Uncle Arthur, and Audrey leaned closer, Eli. Eli was watching her read the label. He looked like he wasn't sure what expression to arrange himself into. Audrey straightened up and went inside without saying anything. But she was smiling. Craig came one last time in April. Not to argue. The divorce was done, there was nothing left to argue about. He came on a Saturday to take Isla to the science center, which was a scheduled visit, and while Isla pulled on her shoes, he stood in the front hallway and looked around the house. Through the open kitchen doorway, Eli was at the table helping Arthur go through the final exercises of his recovery program. They were talking about something, Arthur laughing, Eli shaking his head with a smile. Craig watched that for a long moment. Then Isla took his hand and pulled him toward the door, and he went. When he brought her back 2 hours later, he waited at the gate. Didn't come up the steps. Audrey took Isla inside and then came back out. Craig looked at the house, he said after a moment. You seem okay. I am, Audrey said. He nodded slowly. There was something in his face she recognized, the same expression she'd had in the waiting room, when she'd finally stopped expecting him to walk through the door. He was arriving, finally, at the truth she'd understood 6 months earlier. She didn't feel triumphant. She just felt tired, and then after another moment free. He said, take care of yourself. She said, you too. He got in his car. She went inside. Eli was still at the table when she came back in, though Arthur had gone to rest. He was packing up his bag. He looked at her for a moment. You okay? He asked. Yeah, she said. She sat down at the table. She looked at the exercise cards Arthur had left in a neat stack. I think I'm actually okay. He didn't make a thing of it. He just finished zipping his bag and said, I was going to head out, but I can stay a bit if you want company. She said yes. By May, Arthur had been formally discharged from physiotherapy. His back was strong enough that he'd started talking about returning to work in the fall. The cane that had once been a permanent fixture by the front door was nowhere to be seen. Eli still stopped by sometimes to check on Arthur, sometimes because Robin had cooked and texted him, sometimes because Sunday dinner had quietly become a standing thing and no one had made a conscious decision about it. It had just become true. One Sunday evening in June, after Isla had gone to bed, Audrey found Eli on the back porch while Robin and Arthur washed dishes inside. The yard was going golden with the long light of a Canadian summer evening. He was quiet for a moment after she came out. Then he said, I want to say something, and I don't want you to feel any pressure about it. She waited. I've come to really care about you, he said, and about Isla. He paused. I know that you've been through a lot this past year. I'm not asking for anything right now, but I wanted you to know where I stand. If you ever want to see where this goes, he gestured between them, small, a little uncertain, I'd like that. When you're ready, if you're ready. The backyard was quiet. Through the screen door she could hear Robin saying something to Arthur, and Arthur laughing in that particular way he had. She thought about the hospital waiting room in October. She thought about Isla's hand in hers through the bed rail. She thought about the divorce paperwork on a January afternoon, and the courthouse steps, and the cold air that had felt, unexpectedly, like starting. She looked at Eli. I think I'm ready, she said. He exhaled slowly. Relief, she realized. He'd been nervous. That made her smile properly, the first time she'd smiled like that in a long time, not because something had resolved, but because something was genuinely beginning. Summer arrived, and with it a new routine that no one planned but everyone kept. Saturday mornings meant the farmer's market on Dundas, where Arthur negotiated for cherry tomatoes with the zeal of someone who had very strong opinions about cherry tomatoes, and Eli let Isla choose one thing from every stall, and they always came home with far more than 4 people needed. Sunday evenings meant dinner around the table. Robin cooking something that filled the house. Arthur insisting his contribution was the music selection. Isla setting the napkins in a way that pleased only her. There was a Sunday in August when Isla was chasing a soccer ball around the backyard, and Eli ran after her at half speed, letting her win, and she scored and spun around with her arms out and yelled, "Did you see that?" "Yes," Eli said, dramatically catching his breath. "I cannot keep up with you." She beamed. Then she turned toward the porch where Audrey was watching from the steps with her coffee. "Did you see Eli, Dad?" The words slipped out completely naturally, the way words do when they've been quietly forming for a while and finally find their moment. Isla was already running back toward the ball. Eli had gone still. He turned to look at Audrey. She set her coffee cup down on the step. She looked at her daughter, already kicking the ball, already moving on to the next thing with the breathtaking ease of a child who does not understand how much weight a name can carry. She looked back at Eli. She smiled and picked up her coffee again. Eli let out a breath that had been held a long time. He turned back toward the yard. "Right," he called, jogging after Isla. "One more." Isla shrieked and ran. Audrey sat on the porch and watched the two of them in the warm August light. A year earlier, she had sat in a plastic hospital chair at 2 in the morning, calling a number that went to voicemail, and told herself that everything was going to be fine without quite believing it. She believed it now. Not because everything had been fixed, or because the hard parts were entirely behind her, but because she had learned, slowly and without fanfare, the difference between a life she was enduring and a life she was living. This one, here, with the sound of Isla laughing in the yard and the smell of Robin's dinner drifting from the kitchen and Eli's voice carrying easily across the grass, this was the one she wanted. She had walked out of that hospital alone, and it had been the hardest thing she had ever done. She had walked in the right direction,